3 years. Not one day I didn't see you.
Then why did you choose silence?
Because you deserved more than half of me.
She had exactly 4 minutes to live. That was what the man with the gun pressed against the back of her neck whispered into her ear, his breath hot and sour, his hand shaking just enough to tell her he had never done this before. Rookies were the most dangerous kind. They made mistakes. Messy, permanent mistakes. Sia Taufa, Sia, to everyone who loved her, stood completely still in the underground parking garage of the Hanek Grand Hotel in Seoul, South Korea, her catering uniform splattered with someone else's blood, her heart slamming against her ribs like it was trying to escape before the rest of her body got the memo. 3 years. 3 years she had worked the private events at this hotel. 3 years she had carried silver trays through rooms full of men who wore their wealth like armor and their silence like weapons. 3 years she had pretended not to notice the things she noticed. The envelopes passed under tables, the conversations that stopped the moment she walked in, the way certain guests had security that moved like shadows and watched everyone like they were calculating the exact cost of a mistake. 3 years she had been invisible. Until tonight. Tonight, she had walked through the wrong door, seen the wrong thing, and now a terrified young man with a gun was deciding whether she was worth the trouble of keeping alive. "I didn't see anything," she said. Her voice was remarkably steady for someone who was fairly certain she was about to die in a parking garage in Seoul, South Korea, far away from her mother's house in Nairobi, far away from the sound of rain on a tin roof, far away from everything that had ever felt like home. "I was looking for the service elevator. That's all. I'm just a server." You saw his face. "I see 100 faces a night. I forget all of them by morning. It's a talent." The gun pressed harder. "Shut up. I'm Kenyan," she said, because her mouth had apparently decided that if she was going to die, she was going to die talking. "We don't shut up. It's also a talent." That was when she heard it. Footsteps. Slow. Deliberate. The kind that belonged to a man who had never once rushed toward anything in his life because everything in the world eventually came to him. She felt the shift in the air before she saw him. The young man with the gun felt it too. She could tell by the way his breathing changed, stuttered, became the breathing of a boy who had just realized he was standing in the dark with something far more dangerous than whatever he had been afraid of before. A figure stepped out of the shadow. She had seen him before. Of course she had. In 3 years of carrying trays through rooms full of powerful men, she had noticed him the way you notice a storm on the horizon. Not because you want to, but because your survival instincts refuse to let you look away. Tall. Lean in that deceptive way that meant the strength was hidden, not absent. Dark hair that fell across his forehead like he had never once considered styling it. A jaw that looked like it had been carved out of something expensive. Eyes so dark they absorbed light rather than reflected it, and in those eyes, right now, there was absolutely nothing. No anger. No urgency. No fear. Just cold, quiet calculation. He was Korean. She knew his name the way everyone who worked at this hotel knew his name, in whispers, never out loud, the way you referred to something you respected too much to be casual about. Kwon Seojun. She had never heard him speak. Not once. In 3 years of watching him occupy corners of rooms like he owned not just the room but the air inside it, she had never heard his voice. She had assumed privately that he communicated entirely through intimidating silence and the occasional movement of one very expensive hand. She was about to find out she was wrong. He looked at the man with the gun. He looked at the gun. He looked at Sia. Then he said quietly, in English that carried no accent and every kind of authority, "Put it down." 2 words. That was all. The gun hit the concrete floor so fast it clattered twice before it stopped. Kwon Seojun looked at the young man for exactly 3 seconds. Then he tilted his head almost imperceptibly, and 2 men materialized from the darkness behind him and took the boy away, and he was gone, and it was just Sia and the most dangerous man in Seoul standing in a parking garage at 11:47 at night, and she could hear her own heartbeat. He looked at her. She looked at him. She said, because she was Sia Taufa and she had survived 29 years on this earth by refusing to be small. You know, a simple "Are you okay?" would have also worked. Something shifted in his face. Not a smile. Not quite. But the shadow of something that had once known how to be one. He said nothing. He turned and walked away. and Sia stood in the empty garage, her hands finally shaking now that there was no one left to be brave for, and thought, 3 years. In 3 years, he has never once looked at me. So why did it feel like he had been looking at her all along? Before we begin, my mum said this video cannot reach 10,000 views and 1,000 subscribers. Let's prove her wrong. Smash that like button, subscribe right now, and drop in the comments where you are watching from. Now let's get into this story. She called in sick the next morning. This was notable because Sia Taufa had not called in sick once in 3 years. She had shown up to work through a head cold, through heartbreak, through the time she twisted her ankle on the service stairs and wrapped it herself with a bandage from the first aid kit and finished a 6-hour shift without a single complaint. But today, she lay in her small apartment in Mapogu with her ceiling fan spinning slow circles above her head and thought very seriously about every decision she had ever made that had led her to being held at gunpoint in a parking garage in Seoul. The list was shorter than it should have been. She had come to Seoul 4 years ago on a cooking scholarship that had turned into a catering job that had turned into 3 years of financial stability and what she generously called an adventure and what her mother in Nairobi called a stubborn child refusing to come home. She sent money back every month. She video called every Sunday. She had built a life here out of discipline and wit and the particular Kenyan stubbornness that had carried her family through harder things than a daughter living abroad. She was practical. She was sensible. She knew exactly what kind of men attended private events at the Hanok Grand Hotel, and she had kept her eyes down and her mouth shut and her opinions entirely to herself for 3 years. And then last night she had walked through the wrong door and nearly gotten herself killed and been saved by a man who looked at her like she was a problem he hadn't decided how to solve yet, and then she had made a joke. She had made a joke, and now she was lying on her back at 10 in the morning wondering if she had lost her mind. Her phone buzzed. Unknown number. She stared at it. It buzzed again. She answered. If this is about last night, I already told you I didn't see anything, and I meant it. I have the memory of someone who actively tries not to accumulate trauma. Miss Taufa. The voice was low. Controlled. The kind of voice that had clearly decided long ago how much of itself it was willing to give to any given conversation. This is Kwon Seojun. She sat up so fast she nearly fell off the bed. How did you get this number? I own the hotel. That's not. She stopped. Closed her eyes. Okay. Fine. How can I help you, Mr. Kwon? Silence. The specific kind of silence that felt less like nothing and more like something being considered from multiple angles. Then, are you hurt? She blinked. What? Last night. Are you hurt? It wasn't phrased like a question. It was phrased like information he required and had decided to collect. Sia looked at her hands. She had scrubbed them 3 times this morning. The blood had been someone else's. She still didn't know whose, and she had made a very deliberate decision not to find out. She was uninjured. Shaken in ways that she was packaging very neatly into a box she would open sometime in the next decade. I'm fine, she said. Another pause. Your shift has been reassigned. You will not be returning to the private event floor. Her chin lifted. Excuse me? It is not safe. Lots of things aren't safe. I still do them. I need that job, Mr. Kwon. The private event floor pays triple. You will be paid the same rate, he said. For a different position. What position? Personal assistant. The words landed in the room like something that had been dropped from a significant height. Sia opened her mouth. Closed it. Opened it again. I'm a caterer. You were a caterer. As of this morning, you are my assistant. I don't remember applying for that job. You didn't. A pause. Consider it a promotion. Consider it a... She pressed her hand flat against her forehead. Mr. Kwon. With the greatest respect. You cannot simply decide that a person is your assistant. That is not how employment works. That is not how anything works. I will have a contract sent to your email within the hour. I haven't agreed. The salary is 3 times your current annual income. Dead silence. Her mouth went completely dry. Miss Taufa. She swallowed. I'm here. You saw something last night that could get you killed if the wrong people decide you are a liability. His voice didn't change. Didn't soften or harden. It just carried the information the way gravity carried weight, without effort, without emotion, simply as a fact of the world. The safest place for you, until this is resolved, is close to me. She sat there in her small apartment with the ceiling fan still turning and thought about last night and the gun and the cold concrete and the way he had walked out of the darkness like something the darkness had made specifically for moments like that one. Then she thought about 3 times her annual income. I want 4 times, she said. Silence. 3.5, he said. Done. She stood up. I'll read the contract. She heard something on the other end of the line. It was barely a sound. It was the ghost of a sound. It was the kind of thing you might dismiss as static if you weren't paying very close attention. She was almost certain it was a laugh. He hung up before she could decide. The contract was real. The office was real. The salary, she checked 3 times, was also very much real. What was not real, Sia decided by the end of her first week, was the idea that she had any idea what she had signed up for. Kwon Seojun's legitimate business operation took up the top 4 floors of a glass building in Gangnam that looked like someone had designed it specifically to make normal humans feel inferior the moment they stepped inside. He ran a private equity firm, legitimately, on paper, and she was not going to examine what sat beneath that paper because she enjoyed being alive. He had 12 employees who moved with the quiet efficiency of people who understood that the man they worked for did not believe in wasting time, and who had structured their entire professional existences around not wasting his. Sia lasted 45 minutes before she reorganized his filing system. It was catastrophic, she said, not looking up from the cabinet she was currently sorting with the focused intensity of someone performing surgery. You had client files from 2019 mixed in with quarterly reports from 2022 and what appears to be a takeout menu from a Japanese restaurant that closed 2 years ago. I'm not judging. I'm just saying I understand now why you needed an assistant. She looked up. Kwon Seojun was standing in the doorway of his own office, leaning against the frame with his arms folded, watching her with that same expression she was beginning to catalogue, the one that was not quite blank and not quite engaged and lived somewhere in the middle space where she suspected most of his interior life occurred. I had a system, he said. A system implies intention. What you had was a situation. Something moved in his eyes. Those files were organized by vibes, Mr. Kwon. They were organized by vibes. She turned back to the cabinet. Don't worry. I've saved everything. I just put it somewhere a human being can find it. He was quiet for a moment. You always talk this much? Depends on the room. She slid a folder into its new home with a satisfying click. Quiet rooms make me louder. It's a trauma response. Talking is your trauma response. Talking is my everything response. It's very efficient. She closed the drawer and turned to face him fully, which was always a slightly arresting experience because up close and in daylight he was even more unreasonably good-looking than he was in emergency situations, and she was only human. You could try it sometime. Talking. More than 4 words at a time. I've heard it helps. He looked at her for a long moment. 4 words is sufficient. For what? A grocery list? For most things. She tilted her head. What are the most important 4 words you've ever said? He held her gaze. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, that shadow again, that almost smile that she was beginning to think of as hers simply because she seemed to be the only person capable of producing it. Get out of Seoul. She blinked. She counted. That's 5. He pushed off the doorframe and walked back to his desk. Math is also important. She stared at the back of his head and felt something warm and inconvenient bloom in her chest, and told herself very firmly that it was professional respect and absolutely nothing else. She did not believe herself for a single second. It was absolutely a date. Sia knew it was a date. She was choosing not to say so out loud because the last time she had announced something obvious in Kwon Seojun's presence he had looked at her with that carved stone expression and she had felt it in her stomach in a way she found deeply inconvenient. He had said, very formally, at 4:15 on a Thursday afternoon, there is a dinner. You will accompany me. She had said, as your assistant? He had said, yes. She had said, I'll need to go home and change. He had said, there is a dress. There had, in fact, been a dress. It was hanging in the small room adjacent to his office that she had claimed as her workspace. A deep emerald green that sat against her dark skin like it had been made with that specific combination in mind, because she suspected it had been. She had stood in front of the mirror for a full minute without saying anything, which for Sia was essentially a geological event. The restaurant was the kind of place that did not have a sign outside because the people who needed to know it existed already did. Their table was in a private corner room with screens and soft lighting and a window that looked out over Seoul's nightscape like a painting someone had made specifically for romantic purposes and then pretended was purely architectural. Sia sat across from Seojun, picked up the menu, looked at the prices, and said, "If this is what you call a work dinner, I have some retroactive complaints about my previous catering salary." He looked at her over his own menu. "Order whatever you want." "I always do." She set the menu down. "You didn't choose this restaurant for the ambience and the 16-course menu because you wanted to discuss quarterly reports, Mr. Kwon." He did not look away. "No." That single syllable hit her somewhere behind her sternum. She kept her expression perfectly neutral, which required more effort than she would ever admit. "Then what are we discussing?" "You." "That's a broad topic." "I'm very interesting." "I know." He leaned back. The candlelight did things to the angles of his face that she was cataloguing against her will. "Tell me about Nairobi." She blinked. She had expected many things. She had not expected that. "You did your research. You work for me." "Most employers don't take their assistants to restaurants that cost more than my monthly rent because they want to discuss where I grew up." "I'm not most employers." She laughed, a real one, surprised out of her. "No," she said, when she had recovered. "You are not." She looked at the window, at the lights below. "Nairobi is loud. It's beautiful. It's the kind of city that grabs you by the collar and says pay attention, there isn't time. My mother is there. My sister. A very opinionated grandmother who has informed me that living abroad is fine for a few years, but that I'd better come home before I forget how to cook ugali." She paused. "Do you cook?" "No." "Do you do anything that normal people do for pleasure?" He considered this. He stopped. Something crossed his face, almost uncertainty, which on him looked like a foreign language he was translating slowly. "I read." "What do you read?" "History. Occasionally fiction." "What fiction?" He picked up his wine glass. "Hemingway." She made a face. She could not help it. He noticed. "You disagree." Hemingway wrote about feelings the way someone describes furniture. Very functional. Very minimal. She lifted her own glass. "I prefer writers who bleed a little." He was looking at her with an expression she hadn't catalogued yet. Open was too strong a word. Unlocked was closer. Like a door that had been shut so long the hinges had to be eased. "What do you read?" "Everything." She smiled. "I read everything, Mr. Kwon. Life is too short and there are too many stories." Something about that seemed to reach him in a place he wasn't expecting. He was quiet for a moment. Not his usual silence, which was deliberate and controlled, but something softer, something that felt like thought rather than strategy. "Seojun," he said. She paused. "What?" "My name." His eyes held hers. "Use it." The candlelight flickered. The city moved below them. Sia Taufa sat across from the most dangerous man in Seoul, in a dress the color of deep water, and felt the ground shift very gently beneath her. "Seojun," she said. He looked at her like she had given him something. Like she hadn't even realized she was doing it. "It started with rain." Of course it did. They had been in the field, and by field she meant the part of Seojun's world that her contract technically referred to as accompanying the principal to external engagements and which she had come to understand meant, "Things happen, stay close, trust me." She had gotten surprisingly good at trusting him. It alarmed her every time she noticed it. The meeting had gone sideways. Not dangerously, not this time, just messily, the way negotiations sometimes did when someone on the other side of the table decided to test the limits of Kwon Seojun's patience. She had watched him handle it with the same economy he applied to everything. 3 sentences, 2 silences, and 1 look that made the other man reassess every life decision that had led him to this moment. They had walked out into a Seoul evening that had not bothered to check whether they had umbrellas. The rain came down without apology or warning, and within 30 seconds they were both drenched, and Sia threw her head back and laughed because what else could you do, what else was there to do, and when she brought her head back down he was looking at her with an expression that had entirely abandoned its usual defenses. "What?" she said, rainwater running down her face. "Nothing." But he hadn't looked away. Seojun. She had stopped using the formal address sometime in week 2. He had never asked her to. She had simply started and he had simply let her, and they had never discussed it, which seemed to be how most things between them happened, without announcement, without fanfare, simply as a fact they were both living inside. "What is it?" He reached out and moved a soaking strand of hair from her face. His fingers were very careful. The touch lasted only a moment, but it had the quality of something considered for a long time. She was already looking up at him. She didn't remember deciding to. He kissed her the way he did most things, without preamble, without asking permission, with the quiet certainty of a man who had already considered all the angles and made his decision. It was also, she noticed in the portion of her brain that was still functioning, the opposite of everything else about him. Not quiet. Not minimal. Not efficient. It was the most honest thing she had ever experienced. She kissed him back. She had suspected for some time that if this ever happened she would kiss him back immediately and without the slightest hesitation, and she had been exactly right. They stood in the rain in the middle of a Seoul street, and his hand came up to her jaw and her hands found the front of his shirt, and the city moved around them the way cities do, indifferent, continuous, complete, and she thought, 3 years. We have been in the same building for 3 years. He pulled back. His eyes searched her face. I should have said something, he said. Before. Yes, she agreed. You should have. I didn't know how. I know. She did. She had watched him piece together sentences like they cost him something, and had slowly come to understand that for him they did. Words were not currency he spent lightly. You know how now? He looked at her in the rain, this man who had built an empire on silence and had never once let anyone close enough to see the person living inside all that control, and said, I'm still learning. Her heart did something she would have been deeply embarrassed about if she had been less thoroughly soaked and less thoroughly kissed. Good, she said. I'm an excellent teacher. He touched her face. Not the way you touch something fragile. The way you touch something you have waited a long time to touch and are not willing to rush now that you finally can. I know. They went back to his apartment because the rain wasn't stopping and her apartment was further, and those were the practical reasons, and she was sticking to them. What happened next had nothing practical about it whatsoever. She was not going to think about how long she had been pretending she wasn't thinking about it. Later, much later in the dark with the rain still going and the city below and his arm a solid fact around her, she turned her head and looked at the ceiling and thought, I was supposed to be invisible. She felt him shift. He was not asleep. She hadn't expected him to be. What are you thinking, he said. Not a question. He didn't phrase things as questions. He just made space for the answer. That I reorganized your filing system, she said, and somehow ended up reorganizing my entire life. Silence. Then, against her hair, is that a complaint? Ask me in the morning. She felt it again, that almost laugh, that shadow of something warm that he kept so carefully contained. Against her better judgment, against every practical instinct she possessed, she had fallen entirely and without parachute for a man who expressed his deepest feelings through the precise calibration of his silence. She was, she reflected, absolutely ridiculous. She was also, for the first time in a long time, exactly where she wanted to be. 3 weeks. 3 weeks since the rain. 3 weeks since the beginning of something she didn't have a clean word for. Not dating, not exactly, because Kwon Seojun did not do anything in the conventional way, and she had decided early that demanding conventional from him was like asking the ocean to be a lake. He was what he was. She had made her peace with that and found the peace remarkably comfortable. They had a rhythm. She came to the office. She managed his calendar and his correspondence and occasionally his temper when the men on the other side of his deals mistook his patience for softness. He brought her coffee at exactly 10:15 every morning without ever discussing it. Just appeared at her desk with a cup fixed the exact way she liked it, black with 1 spoon of honey, and set it down and went back to his office without a word. She had started leaving a single piece of whatever she had baked the night before on the corner of his desk. He ate it every time. He never mentioned it. They were, she had concluded, speaking a language they had invented between themselves, and she was unexpectedly fluent. She was at her desk on a Tuesday afternoon, working through an itinerary for a Busan meeting that she already had 4 concerns about and was composing an email to express those concerns with maximum tact and minimum sugarcoating, when her phone buzzed. It was not Seojun's number. It was a number she did not recognize, and the message was 4 words and a photograph. The 4 words were, "We know about you." The photograph was of her. Outside the building. Yesterday. With Seojun. She sat completely still for 3 seconds. Then she stood up, walked to his office door, and knocked twice. The knock he had told her meant now, not when you're ready. He looked up. Read her face. Was on his feet before she had said a word. She showed him the phone. He looked at it for a long time. She watched the careful architecture of his expression do something she had only seen once before. In a parking garage with a gun, when someone had put her in danger. It wasn't anger. It was colder than anger. It was the thing that lived beneath the discipline, that had built the empire and held it and would not, she understood this with absolute certainty, allow anything to touch what it had decided to protect. Seojun. Her voice was steady. She was proud of that. Who sent this? He set her phone down on his desk and looked at her. Someone who wants to remind me that I have something worth losing. She absorbed that. And do you? He looked at her for a long moment, that dark, still gaze that she had once found unreadable and now read like her mother tongue. Then he did something she was not prepared for. He came around the desk. He took her face in both hands very carefully, the way he did everything with her, deliberate, considered, like she was something he had decided mattered. And he said, quietly, in the voice he only used for her, the voice that existed somewhere beneath the 4-word economy and the silence and the empire. 3 years ago, you walked into a room carrying a tray of champagne and you tripped on the threshold, just slightly, just enough that the glasses shook but nothing fell. You recovered in half a second. No one else noticed. She stared at him. You remember that? I noticed everything, he said. From the beginning. I just didn't know what to do about it. Her heart was doing something extremely unprofessional. And now? He searched her face. Something moved behind his eyes, something that had clearly been living in the controlled dark of him for a very long time and had finally decided it was done being patient. I have to tell you something, he said. About who I am. About what this, he stopped. Started again. About what they will do to reach me through you, if I let you stay. And if I leave? Then you're safe. His thumbs traced her cheekbones. And I am. He stopped again. She watched him search for the word. She watched him find it. Finished, he said quietly. She covered his hands with hers. Seojun. You should leave, he said. That's the logical answer. She lifted up onto her toes and kissed him once, softly, and pulled back and looked at him and said, Ask me the question. He knew which question. She could see it in his face, the thing he had been carrying since the message arrived, maybe since before that, maybe since a parking garage 3 weeks ago, maybe since a girl with a tray of champagne tripped on a threshold 3 years ago and recovered before anyone could see. He looked at her. And said, Will you trust me with your life? The room went completely quiet. And before Sia could answer, her phone on his desk lit up again. A second message. Different number. 3 words. She looked down at the screen. Read them. Looked back up at Seojun. His jaw was set. His eyes were already moving, already calculating, already 3 steps into whatever came next, but they came back to her. They always came back to her. What does it say? She asked, even though she could read it herself. He picked up the phone. Read it. Set it face down. And said, with the quietest, most controlled urgency she had ever heard from him, We need to go. Right now. She grabbed her bag. And as they moved toward the door, his hand at the small of her back, firm and warm and certain, the way it always was, she thought about the 3 words on the screen. She thought about what they meant. About what came next. About the fact that somewhere between a parking garage and a rainy street and 10:15 coffee and honey and a dress the color of deep water, she had stopped being invisible. And someone had noticed. To be continued in part 2. Drop in the comments. Did you see that message coming? What do you think it said? If you want part 2, smash that like button right now and subscribe, because this story is just getting started, and trust me, you are not ready for what Seojun does next.